Welcome to this first session of the conference, which will focus on media and governance across the Commonwealth, new policy directions. We'll be looking in this panel at challenges to freedom of expression and the incidence of impunity in Commonwealth countries, which in some cases are now at worryingly high levels, and how the Commonwealth should be responding to this situation. We'll be looking at these issues not just in terms of relations between the media community and governments or non-government actors, but within the framework of governance in Commonwealth countries, taking into account the role of Parliament and judiciary as well. Of course, the Commonwealth has its Charter of Values and its Latimer House principles, which set benchmarks for the three main branches of government and to some extent for the media as well. But in recent times, it has to be said, it's not been playing a leading role in this field. Now, to discuss these issues from a number of different perspectives, we have a distinguished panel of speakers whose depth of experience is clear from the biographies which you already have to hand. William Horsley is a former BBC correspondent who's now the international director of the Centre for Freedom of the Media at Sheffield University and the convener of the Media Freedom Committee of the Commonwealth Journalists Association, of which I am also a member, which is seeking to develop new benchmarks for media and governance in the Commonwealth. Williams worked closely with the UN on the development of its UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists. He's advised the Council of Europe on its guidelines for member states on media freedom, and he's also the vice president of the Association of European Journalists. Mark Stevens, on my right, is a solicitor specialising in media law, intellectual property rights and human rights with the firm Howard Kennedy. The Times has described him as one of the best advocates for freedom of expression in the country. He's a past president of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, familiar with the state of freedom of expression in different Commonwealth countries and impediments to it, and he will be talking about that in his presentation. Lawrence McNamara, on my left, is Reader in Law at York University and Senior Research Fellow at the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, which is actually based in this building, and is part of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. He's a specialist on media law, security and accountability, and the role of the judiciary and the executive in these areas. What he'll be talking about is a recent British experience in the UK arising from a media coverage of the Article 50 litigation in the Miller case, the notorious Daily Mail headline, "Enemies of the People," and the ways in which that illustrates the way the rule of law, press freedom and judicial independence are or are not being defended in this country. Lord Black, Guy Black, is the Executive Director of the Telegraph Media Group and Chairman of the Commonwealth Press Union Media Trust. He was Director of the Press Complaints Commission from 1996 to 2003 and Director of Communications for the Conservative Party from 2003 to 5. He's someone with very extensive experience of the way the media works in the UK and in the Commonwealth. He's going to be looking at why press freedom is important in development and trade terms and what we can do to enhance it throughout the Commonwealth. Each panel speaker will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and I propose to take a limited number of questions at the end of each presentation. If all goes well, this will leave 10 to 15 minutes for general discussion at the end. So first, William Horsley, who is going to talk about the Commonwealth's troubled record on media freedom and the rule of law, about the Commonwealth Journalists Association initiative, and also on the practical suggestions that for the Commonwealth's active engagement at national, regional and UN level. William.
Good morning, everybody. I feel a bit like a lion tamer here. I shall be pressing that and hopefully the PowerPoint, which was briefly lost in the dungeon of my computer last night, will work.
Shall we sit
Thank you
at the
very
front?
much. Huge congratulations first to Sue and the organisers, and to those who are going to set up the Commonwealth Centre for Freedom of the Media. It's long overdue. It's going to be a centre of excellence to help inform policy, and it's extremely welcome. As your introductory note said, what is required is greater concerted action by governments and civil society in order to fulfil the Commonwealth's loudly spoken commitments. This, you'll be familiar, the three monkeys of Chinese legend: hear, speak, and see no evil. I feel very very lowly in the company of the high-powered lawyers and the press baron on the panel here. So, but I do see my role as giving a little bit of an overview about the hostile environment that has developed for journalists worldwide. After my 25 years as a BBC correspondent, I've spent about 10 years watching these processes very closely and having a role where I could. So the Commonwealth also has a very troubled record in this area, so a little bit about that, and how some practical ideas about how it can change and live up to its commitments, particularly if it abandons the idea of treating the media as an area of government patronage, and instead devotes itself to following international standards and norms which have been enormously well developed through law and through regional organizations and through the UN and UNESCO, and Guy Berger of UNESCO is at the back, so really he should be here in place of me. So two big changes in the environment for journalists globally, and this affects many Commonwealth countries as well. One is that around the turn of the century, journalists somehow lost the label of neutrality and became targets, both for states and for non-state actors and militants who wanted to silence them or simply control the messages. And the other is that the deaths and attacks on journalists suddenly grew in the area of reporting of corruption, crime, and politics, and not just journalists in war zones getting killed in crossfire or whatever. While that's been going on, as I say, the international standards have been developed to a remarkable degree with the UN Human Rights Committee, the top committee of lawyers, the work of the Council of Europe and the European Court, which has already set extraordinarily solid standards for protection of freedom of expression, with the broadest scope of protection of all, which is being eroded by the action of many governments. Similar things happening in the African and Latin American sphere against a great reluctance of states. So the Commonwealth has been largely absent from these debates, unfortunately, but we have heard from the incoming Secretary General a number of very encouraging words, and including linking the idea of protection of freedom of expression and the work of media to Commonwealth major goals, for example, the fight against corruption, protecting women against violence and attack in conflict, and reforming civil and criminal justice reform. We want to help that process. So this is an example of mobilization of the media, together with representatives from the International Criminal Court, the NGOs, and at the BBC. This was in April of 2014, and it's an example of what CFOMR Centre, together with BBC Global News and 40 or more major international news organisations can do when they come together to raise awareness. You can see journalism is not a crime. It was the time of the campaign to release the Al Jazeera journalists in jail in Egypt, Peter Grester, Bahir Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy, but it goes much wider than that. Peter Horrocks, the head of Global News, said on that occasion, and I think this is something that media should listen to, that we should be doing more reporting on this issue and more influencing. So if journalists are no longer neutral, they are targets in this thing, they need to have an influence on the way policies develop. And this is, excuse me for putting this one up, this is myself with Jackie Harrison from University of Sheffield presenting a statement at an earlier time. It was 2012, with another long list of eminent journalist groups and media, including Guy Black himself, I'm glad to say, to the Deputy Director of UNESCO. And Guy will, I hope, be able to say more about the UN Action Plan. But from the point of view of journalists and NGOs, it seems to me this is a receptacle. It is a multi-stakeholder activity, which is it is an avenue for those who need protection to find ways of working together and with UN agencies, with in-country programs, with focus on a number of countries at a particular risk, like Pakistan and Nepal and parts of Latin America in the early stages and so on. We haven't got time to go into that, but it's important to note that the international system can be responsive and has been. So the CJA is an organisation with branches in all parts of the Commonwealth, and only a year ago, almost exactly this week actually, Rita Payne took credit for organising a Congress here in London, and we handed over to Mahendra Ved as the leader. And these are just a few of the things that came up. There was a general mood of, I have to say, pessimism, even close to despair sometimes, at the conditions in which journalists live, both because of direct threats of violence, hostile, media hostile laws, abuse of law, and harassment of many kinds. So Hamid Mir had been shot very recently. He still has to explain to the security people at airports when he goes through that he's got several bullets still in the lower half of his body because it wasn't safe to remove them. That was in Karachi. Important to note that the kidnapping of Daniel Pearl in 2004, I think, was a turning point in this story of journalists becoming deliberate targets, both to intimidate and to try and control the story. And we've seen much more from ISIS and so on since then. The quote from Lasantha Wickramatunge is a chilling one. You're all familiar with this probably. He wrote his own posthumous editorial about his death in 2009, and you can see what it's. I hope you can read some of it from the back. Murder's become the primary tool whereby the state seeks to control the organs of liberty. Today, the journalists, tomorrow, judges. When I'm killed, it'll be the government that kills me. I want to draw attention to this as well. We had discussions in London a year ago about repression in Uganda, in Gambia, which of course has had a change of regime ever since in many forms. But it is important to note that the journalists in Africa at the end of the Cold War and when apartheid fell themselves demanded action and protection. And in this declaration in Namibia in 1991, they had this declaration which I think is the foundation. It led to the establishment of World Press Freedom Day a couple of years later through a UN General Assembly resolution. And this is the essence of the demand for states and in regional and international organizations to observe the rules, the international rules that have been established, and not to treat the media as a plaything. So we established a Media Freedom Committee, David Page and I, and we have been working on, we'll talk about it later, some draft principles for the media and in the Commonwealth, which we'll discuss, but not in very great detail because it hasn't yet been lawyered. So I thought that it would be useful to draw attention to the really shocking record of many Commonwealth countries when it comes to the number of journalists killed, and particularly the failure to resolve, to find the killers. This is a peculiar aspect of attacks on journalists. In Russia, for example, the general rate of clearing up of murders is something like 80 or 90%, and in the case of journalists, there's only a handful out of scores of journalists who've been killed in the last 20 years. But look at this record. Bangladesh, 9, including 5 bloggers in 1 year last year, many of them attacked in the street by mobs and so on religious, because of their secular beliefs. India, as many as 23, And again, all the cases unresolved. And in the case of UNESCO's request for information to member states, an important procedure, mechanism for fact-finding. In the Indian case, only 2 out of 23 did the state so far give any information as of last November when this Director General's report came out. Nigeria, a similar picture with 7, Pakistan 51. Many people believe that in the last 10 years or so the number is much higher than that. But again, all of those ones unresolved. Daniel Pearl and one other at least was resolved, but again, most of them without any information coming from the state. Sri Lanka, where of course most of the killings took place at an earlier time of the Civil War, and Uganda similar. And the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, one of those organisations which does superb work in fact-finding and challenging governments in very difficult circumstances, finds that in the latest annual report, 4 out of 12 of the states on the index with more than 5 outstanding cases of impunity of journalists killed in the last 5 years, 10 years are from Commonwealth. So, what about some concrete actions? Well, here's some guidelines to think about. The UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity, which is the multi-agency program which was involved when Jackie Harrison and I were talking with UNESCO, and it was a launch type conference in Vienna in 2012. It says this about the role of regional and global and sub-global organizations. One of the goals of the plan is to reinforce that collaboration and encourage incorporation of media development strategies and safety of journalists into their strategies. Wouldn't it be good if the Commonwealth would listen to that? Secondly, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Again, enormous amount of lobbying took place in order to get Goal 16, and particularly 1610, on building accountable and inclusive institutions, which includes access to information and access to justice. And in particular, the indicator 1610.1, I think is important here. The Commonwealth has said that the heads of government said at the end of their last CHOGM in Malta that they want the Commonwealth to be a champion of the SDGs. Well, here's a way we could do it. The Commonwealth could work together to ensure that all the countries where killings and kidnappings and arbitrary detentions of journalists take place are recorded, and then there is a peer review process, which is also mirrored, of course, in the UPR, in the UPR process and so on. So very quickly here, this is worth looking at. The General Assembly resolution passed without, by consensus, no votes against. It includes all the areas from the legal framework, awareness raising in the judiciary, etc., to monitoring and reporting of attacks and funding the prosecution. It also proclaimed International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. So that is celebrated, that is marked every year, and the source of many activities. These we've got no time to go into them, but here we are. The African Court and the African Court of Human and People's Rights and the ECOWAS Court have addressed these issues. There have been a series of gatherings of lawyers, judges, and NGOs and media in Europe, in Strasbourg, in Costa Rica, Latin America, Inter-American system, and in Arusha, Tanzania. And these are just some of the landmark judgments which should set a marker for international, for the law in states. So the Connaughton case, very important in Africa. The prison for defamation is a violation of the African Charter. The killing of Haidara in Gambia, again, it was a violation of the right to life and so on, but the ECOWAS judgment was not implemented, and here we have only 24 out of 54 African states have ratified the important protocol allowing people to take their cases directly to the court. That is something that the Commonwealth could surely address as well, and this is all part of this inter-regional dialogue which UNESCO is at the heart of, and many regional organisations and CFOM. So new policy directions. This is really starters for 10, thoughts for thought. if the Commonwealth is really going to change itself round, make media freedom and governance integral to the agenda, consider when they're ready, after more consultation, but not too much, the draft Commonwealth principles. David Page and I have been working on covering all the main areas of rights and responsibilities, regulation, the judiciary's role, etc., etc. Make the Commonwealth a partner in the UN Action Plan. Could be done very simply, I imagine. The guys here, perhaps you've got a form you can sign on the dotted line. And I think a political and cultural shift, as I say, from patronage to observance of international standards. Further down the line, reform colonial era laws, which we'll be hearing about a lot today, I think, and the role of benchmarks and mechanisms to make all this happen is important. And I think it's important to note here, I've mentioned the OSCE system because it's a consensus organization like the Commonwealth. It's not based on treaties, and yet they have the courage to mandate a separate independent office to do the early warning alerts and cooperation for states to try and bring them into line with their commitments and indeed with European international law. Council of Europe has been very active, allowing civil society real influence in policy making, and this online system of alerts, which you can see on the Council of Europe, just Council of Europe at FOM, and the UN Plan of Action as a multi-stakeholder thing, and of course bearing in mind that the Commonwealth Summit is only a year away, so that should be an enormous opportunity. Final point here, the Journalism Safety Research Network is something that the University of Sheffield is working on in conjunction with UNESCO. It's open to all who do research of any kind in this field, and we very much hope you'll look it up on the CFOM website and sign on and be part of it. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much. So, Mark, would you like to say something about the Commonwealth? I mean, I think Mark will talk generally about the Commonwealth, his very extensive experience of Commonwealth countries and impediments to freedom of expression in them.
Thank you very much, David. I wanted to sort of pick up from the penultimate bullet point that we had with William, which was about the criminalisation of speech as the colonial legacy. And I think it's very interesting because I think it's through this prism and through this lens that we actually get to understand where the impediments lie. And of course what we had was, during the colonial period, we criminalised speech which was unacceptable to the minority occupying power, namely us. And as a consequence of that, you have things like insult laws, which made it a criminal offence to insult a district officer, who would of course be the lowest form of white life, male, because all of them were male. And as a consequence of that, that was the lowest level. And of course the idea was that you could lock up people who were difficult or saying things that were inconvenient. And it's through that we also get the use of sedition laws, of scandalising the court, and generally of criminal libel in many countries. What we have seen evolve is that through international courts and tribunals and fora, and again William raised this with the African court, which has made it clear that criminal libel, you can only fine someone for it, you can't actually go to jail for it. And so it is for these insult laws, and also if you want to insult the president, or there are similar offences like harming the economic interests of the country. So for example, I had a case where I was defending the Wall Street Journal, which was accurately reporting the slide of the Rand, and the South African government sought to bring criminal proceedings for harming the economic interests of the South African state. Now, I think eventually they saw the wisdom or the lack of wisdom in bringing that proceeding forward, and it didn't go to trial. But it's those kinds of cases, when they come up, that present the opportunity for lawyers around the Commonwealth to actually challenge them in the international courts and in the international forums and tribunals. There's a brilliant QC hidden somewhere amongst us, Keelan Gallagher from down. Yes, I see you back there, Keelan. Yes, who is bringing many with her colleagues, bringing many of these challenges, both in the African Court, the ECOWAS Court, the Inter-American Court, and this is a way of actually expunging these laws and creating new standards which are coherent and congruent with the international standards which UNESCO and the other international treaty bodies come together with. There do seem to me, though, areas of problem where we're not yet able to push back, and I was very pleased that our colleague from Malaysia stood up and raised the issues of the problems there. And the problems there are the overuse of sedition laws, which are problems, the licensing of the media, but also ownership of the media. In that particular country, all the major media, all traditional media, are owned or operated by either the government or lackeys and acolytes of the government. And therefore you only get one perspective, which is why they have such a vibrant alternative online media, which is, so virtually everybody in the country reads both the traditional media or watches the television news, but also reads the online media, which gives an alternative perspective. And it really is this change which I think has marked out a difference. And in Malaysia, it's very difficult to make challenges because they're not yet part of an international system. They are in the process of joining and creating the ASEAN Court of Human Rights, which I think will be up and coming before 2020, but it's not going to be any time immediately. But the key issue seems to be that governments are looking to control traditional media, and this, I think, is creating a problem. I've seen an investment house, which is an American-based investment house, which is going around the world, buying up relatively cheaply traditional media, usually newspapers, and pimping them up using the skills and techniques of very high-end, high-quality US former editors of places like the Wall Street Journal and such like, and then selling them off locally so that people can buy influence within their own local communities. Well, you know, Rupert Murdoch's been doing it for a long time, and now other people are getting into the game. And these are not intended to be profit centres in terms of their organisations, but they are profitable in the sense that they advance the interests of the owner. And I think this is a problem, and we should identify it and seek to remedy it. The other area, which is, I think, of enormous concern, and I think those from traditional media backgrounds tend to miss it, is in relation to the shutting down, network shutdown. So effectively, the internet is no longer accessible. So if you are in a country like Malaysia, which has a very strong and vibrant alternative narrative available on the internet, then in those circumstances, in some countries, they're now shutting them down. So just take as an example, we're on, I think we are on day 80 in Cameroon of an internet shutdown. They have shut the internet down completely for the last 80 days. So you can't get in touch with your bank, you can't buy anything online, and you certainly can't read anything. The other countries, Uganda, Museveni during the elections shut down not just telephony, but also the internet. And the problem with telephony, of course, was that he shut down access to doctors, to the emergency services, as well as banking and other applications which are so prevalent from people's handphones. So I think there is a real issue around this approach. And indeed, some countries, and Turkey and Egypt are probably foremost amongst them, in the way in which they have scaled back from full-scale, country-wide internet shutdowns and telephony shutdowns so that you can't communicate, and therefore the idea is that this prevents disruption and disorder. But they've actually now started to throttle back, so that what they will do is sometimes they will just shut Facebook, for example, or they will just shut another form of application, YouTube. Sometimes they will geographically shut down. So, for example, around Tahrir Square, you can't upload anything, you won't be able to make calls or anything if you happen to be within, a mile of Tahrir Square, but as soon as you walk away, the cell towers come online, and then you can start to upload and communicate with your friends and colleagues as you would before. And the idea of this is that if you have a countrywide shutdown, it's indiscriminate and it's clearly disproportionate and illegal. And what they're trying to do is to say, well, actually, we've got a very specific problem that we have here in Turkey or Egypt, and therefore we are confining the problems to those particular locations. And so I do think that, we have to remember that the right to speak is being impeded, but also the rights of the citizens to receive all shades and colours of opinion is also being impeded here. And so we've got two fundamental rights being in conflict there. I do think that creates a challenge for us. I did just want to highlight also the risks that we're seeing in relation to the increasing use of data in journalism, and how that is making both journalists and their sources increasingly susceptible to targeting. Some people in the room were in Brussels last week for RightsCon. They have decided that traditionally they would go back to San Francisco, Silicon Valley. Next year they've decided that they cannot go there, and they will be going to Toronto, because the Americans now have laws where even if you happen to be a journalist, they can inspect your computer and you have to give over the data at the border if they so request. Now, of course, for investigative journalists or people with confidential sources or people with data, that is an incredibly troubling development, and I think it marks the seriousness with which those individuals have taken that RightsCon has decided to move to another country. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we just need to be thinking about the different ways in which our governments are trying to restrict this, and we see that with Amber Rudd using the excuse of the atrocity on Westminster Bridge to find a backdoor way into WhatsApp. And again, that's going to create challenges for journalists across the world, as well as NGOs and others. So I think with that, I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. So let us now turn to Lawrence McNamara, who is given a title to his talk, Press Freedom, Judicial Independence and the Rule of Law After Miller, a Changing Landscape, ?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present and speak today. What I want to talk about is some of the things that have happened recently in the UK. My apologies to those of you who feel you've had just about enough of Brexit, which might be almost everybody. But I want to do this in a way that looks at how there are new policy directions that are emerging in the UK around the relationship between the media, the judiciary, and the government. And then to look at the implications of that for jurisdictions where the rule of law, where press freedom and where judicial independence are more fragile, as is the case, as we've just heard, in a number of Commonwealth states. The Miller case, as many of you will know, was the case around whether the UK government could formally commence leaving the EU, triggering Article 50. Could they do this without the approval of Parliament? In November last year, a bench of 3 judges on the High Court said parliamentary authority was required. In January this year, the Supreme Court, a bench of 9 judges, agreed. And the press coverage surrounding this, the reaction of the government, in particular the reaction of the government minister, the Lord Chancellor, brought up quite a range of debate, and I want to talk a little bit about how that happened. I also find of so great interest and relevance the quote William put up earlier from the posthumous editorial, that today it's the journalists and tomorrow it's the judges, and the contrast between these different arms of democratic governance, I would describe it as more broadly. I want to start with three sets of principles that sit as the background. The first is the Latimer House principles on the three branches of government. These are the Commonwealth principles. Among them, they say the criminal law and contempt proceedings should not be used to restrict legitimate criticism of the performance of judicial functions. They also say that the principles of judicial accountability and independence underpin public confidence in the judicial system and the importance of the judiciary as one of the three pillars upon which a responsible government relies. They say that government's transparency and accountability is promoted by an independent and vibrant media which is responsible, objective and impartial, and which is protected by law in its freedom to report and comment upon public affairs. They say that the executive must refrain from all measures directed at inhibiting freedom of the press. There are other references as well, but that's the starting point of some background. The second point of background is, in the UK, the Lord Chancellor has a particular responsibility. And the Lord Chancellor is a government minister. The role was reformed in 2005 under the Constitutional Reform Act. But the Lord Chancellor must uphold the continued independence of the judiciary, says Section 3 of the legislation. And when the Lord Chancellor takes their oath, they say that I do swear that in the office of the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain, I will respect the rule of law, defend the independence of the judiciary, and then they need to provide resources to the courts. But it's those first two things. They will respect the rule of law and defend the independence of the judiciary. And the third set of principles by way of background is, in the UK, we no longer have the offence of scandalising the court. And this I will come back to at the end, because that issue of using the criminal law to regulate the media has been really important in at least two ways in the last 6 months here. So I want to just turn a little bit to the Miller case and talk a little bit about what happened. In the Miller case, the High Court said parliamentary authority is required. This is after the referendum where Britain voted 52 to 48% to leave the EU. And you have the front page of the Mail, which many of you will have seen, which is the pictures of the three judges and the big headline, Enemies of the People. The Mail did that. The Telegraph went for, again, the three pictures, the judges versus the people. There's a range of other headlines as well. The Daily Star, one of our more down-market tabloids, had posh folks in Brexit betrayal. But some of the other analysis was more detailed. Now, the media reaction to this was really marked. The political reaction to the media coverage then was very strong. You had a range of government ministers and former Lord Chancellors come out very critical of the Daily Mail. The legal profession loves nothing more than talking about the legal profession, so it also came out very strongly critically of the Daily Mail. I think it was the 9th of November, it was at least 48 hours, then a few days after that, that the Lord Chancellor's reaction to this was, it is not the job of government or Lord Chancellor to police the headlines, and it would be a dark day for democracy if that changed. The Lord Chancellor also said, it is unlikely that the High Court is imperilled by the opinions of any newspaper. My own views were, and they were, I think, not uncommon, was that the Lord Chancellor can believe in a free press, but it doesn't mean the Lord Chancellor can't criticise the press, that they can't respond to that criticism. The absence of a scandalising the court law, I think, was incredibly important, because if such a law existed, it would have shaped the entire debate, I think, around the conversation would have shifted to should there be a prosecution of the press here. There were other things about the conversation I'll come to, but the Lord Chancellor was heavily criticised for not defending the judiciary. When it came to the Supreme Court, along the way, the coverage, if I can find my show and tell materials, the coverage at the time of the hearings in December included by the Mail this piece, The Judges and the People. And it has the pictures of our 9 Supreme Court judges. It has our pictures of our 9 Supreme Court judges, and under each of them they have a little rating for their European Europhile status, like 4 stars out of 5, 4 not being very good. They then, when the judgment was handed down in January, shifted to, sorry, I've got newspapers everywhere here, shifted to champions of the people, because that was a reference to the dissenting judge, or judges. You have this move by the Mail along the way, being taking the running on this, that to some extent they wound back their response. They avoided the enemies of the people, they shifted along, but the problem is the judges are arguably neither enemies nor champions of the people in these respects, not in the way the Mail meant it. The Lord Chancellor's reaction after the Supreme Court was much more measured and instant in a pre-prepared press release. Our independent judiciary is the cornerstone of the rule of law, vital to our constitution and freedoms. And they said, we might not agree, but we will always follow the judgments. The Lord Chancellor later said to the House of Lords Constitution Committee, I might respectfully disagree with some who've asked me to condemn what the press are writing, but I think it is dangerous for a government minister to say that this is an acceptable headline and this is not, or the other is not. Judges, she said, should speak out more about the work they do to ensure it's widely understood. So you have this kind of curious thing where the government is out and out defending press freedom, but kind of throwing the judiciary to the wolves. The judicial reaction to this was, to say the least, well, by judicial standards in Britain, very strong. The President of the Supreme Court said there was a degree of dismay, even went so far as to say considerable dismay. The Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, this is both in the last week these comments have been made, said, I believe the Lord Chancellor is completely and utterly wrong in her view. It is clear we must maintain a free press. I also believe people ought to criticise us. Criticism is healthy, but there's a difference between criticism and abuse which I do not think is understood. The Lord Chief Justice also says, it is not understood either how absolutely essential it is that we are protected, because we have to act as our oath requires us, without fear or favour, affection or ill will. And he then, just in case they'd missed it first time, says the Lord Chancellor was completely and absolutely wrong. Nobody would like to be on the receiving end of that from a senior judge. The question then of what we kind of take out of some of this, I think, is that there is a recalibration in the UK as a result of this, of the role of the Lord Chancellor and the judiciary's engagement with the media. It's been a long time coming. 10 years ago, this was already on the horizon. There's a series of statements from the judiciary and the media, but it is a slight recalibration, albeit a very significant one. The types of questions to my mind that the Commonwealth as an organisation might pursue are some of the things that William referred to earlier about training and about enriching the understanding of each arm of the democratic process, including the fourth estate, about what the roles of each are. And that might include developing within government a respect both for the judiciary and for press freedom. It might include, in different jurisdictions, training around what in judicial independence is. Some journalists, and I suspect I'm preaching to the converted, obviously have a great understanding of what judicial independence is and how it matters to the rule of law. But that needs to come across more often, perhaps. There is some really important contextual things here. One is that because there was no criminal law about scandalising the court, I think this is why this conversation could happen as it did. Had there been a criminal law, this would have been very different, I think. It also mattered that in Britain, neither the rule of law nor press freedom are imperilled. That is, the Lord Chancellor is right. This is not imperiling the High Court. It's not imperiling the Supreme Court to have these kind of statements. But the problem, I think, and the thing I would suggest that comes out of this in terms of a Commonwealth conversation is, where does the benchmark lie? To say that something must be imperiled before there is an adequate response, that's far too low. There needs to be a much richer conversation about the relationship of the different arms of government and the media and how each supports the other. The conversation that happened, the headlines in the Daily Mail, my ultimate view of that is, what an incredible waste. We had one of the most remarkable constitutional moments in generations, and there was reporting and headlines that didn't do it justice. On the other hand, what came out of it was actually a really, really significant conversation about the role of the Lord Chancellor and how you manage the rule of law. And I think that's the kind of thing that actually Commonwealth processes might take forward, albeit the circumstances are much different in other countries. I think the principles that come out of it, it poses some really valuable questions that can be taken forward. Thanks very much.
So now, Guy, would you like to?
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here. As you heard, I'm chairman of the Commonwealth Press Union Media Trust, and my fellow trustees, Patsy Robertson is here, are very delighted and pleased to be able to support this initiative. Many of you will know a fair bit about the CPU. For very nearly a century, and from 1908, the CPU, the Imperial Empire Press Union before that, played an important global role in fighting for press freedom, but because of the enormous commercial pressures on the media, we ceased to operate as a full-time organisation in 2008, but the CPU Media Trust took over the reins as best it could, and today we operate as a virtual entity, keeping alive the flame of the never-ending battles that we've all been talking about today. And I'd just like to congratulate all those who have been involved in putting this conference together. I know what hard work it is to achieve something like this, and I think it's fantastic that it's happened so that we can keep the spotlight on this hugely important issue of freedom of expression. It's one of the great ironies of our time here in the UK that whilst the Commonwealth was largely ignored for many years by people in the media and by politicians, it's now hailed as central to our destiny and our economic success in the post-Brexit world. And forgive me, I'm going to have to just do a little bit more Brexit. And how I just wish that so many of those who suddenly see our salvation in trade with the Commonwealth had paid the slightest bit of attention to it before, but there you go. The truth is, we've got a lot of ground to make up and a lot of fences to mend, because in my view, the Commonwealth was for many years seen largely here as an inconvenience at best and an irrelevance at worst. and crucial relationships were neglected. Funding for Commonwealth institutions and organisations, the CPU included, dried up. Education about the Commonwealth became non-existent, and we in effect turned our back on vital global alliances. And in turn, if we're honest, Commonwealth countries sensing that moved away from Britain, seeking new trading partners and allies, and often finding them in another new economic power, China. And those who think we can make up for years of neglect and indifference simply with platitudes and wishful thinking may find that there is a rude awakening ahead. And of course, as we now, and some may say there's an element of history repeating itself, turn our back on our European partners, just as we did with the Commonwealth, there will be a surge of interest in new global trade deals with countries and cultures that we've ignored in the past. And there's something else that we've brushed under the carpet in the past and could do so no longer in this context, which is that the Commonwealth faces incredibly tough challenges in terms of leadership, of economic development, of the fundamental principles of good governance, of basic human rights, and of living up to the terms, the noble terms of the Commonwealth Charter. And it seems to me, and this is why I think today is very well timed, if we're serious about our long-term trading prospects with the Commonwealth, then we have to get serious about these issues too. And today's issue of media freedom is one that lies at the very heart of that. A few years ago, the UK government launched something called the Building Stability Overseas strategy, which had a great deal of good to say about helping to build, quotes, strong, legitimate institutions and robust societies capable of managing tensions and shocks, so there is a lower likelihood of instability and conflict. That strategy rightly identified what it called a web of institutions to provide the basis of trust and confidence in society. The police, legal and judicial systems, banks, religious and civil society groups, which are needed for a country to prosper. And it noted how corruption and bad governance needed to be rooted out, not least because this was a precursor to economic growth. Central to the achievement of all those goals, in my view, is recognising the role in a stable society of a free and independent media. And that's the point I really want to highlight today, because free media is not just a desirable end in itself. It's not just a totemic thing. It's an instrument of development and economic progress. And a report from UNESCO back in 2008 called Press Freedom and Development highlighted that in a very cogent way, the correlation between media freedom and economic and social progress. Noting, for instance, how no country that has both a free press no country that has a free press has a very large percentage of its population living below the poverty line, how life expectancy improves as governance does, and how media freedom makes it all the more likely that effective public health policies, particularly in areas like HIV/AIDS, for example, will be introduced. And it gives some very good examples from Ghana and Kenya in particular, where the free media has played a crucial role in improving environmental conservation and women's rights. And the reason for that is that a media that's free and robust, India, Botswana, Kenya, the Caribbean island states, always calls government to account. So a free media can never really exist with the corruption and bad governance which hampers economic development, undermines political institutions and fuels the grievances of an impoverished population. State-run media with the criminal sanctions and statutory controls on content, journalists cowed by the threat of jail, always end up doing a government's bidding. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, where economic and social progress has been slowest, that means the propagation of misinformation campaigns through which the population is actively misled. And there could be no better or more tragic example of that than Zimbabwe, where the government holds a vice-like grip on all information, with grave consequences for public health, which means that in Zimbabwe, life expectancy is now less than 35 years of age, which is what it was here in 1815. So one of the reasons I'm continually frustrated that media freedom and the positive role that free independent media can play is not given a greater priority in the formation of policy, because it should be the foundation stone on which all other progress, from women's rights to environmental protection to infant mortality to HIV/AIDS is based. It barely gets to look into the Millennium Development Goals. The strategy I mentioned just now ignores it completely, other than quite rightly highlighting the role of the World Service. And of course there is the commitment, but it's more honoured in the breach than the observance, to open dialogue and free flow of information in the Commonwealth Charter. But the fundamental truth is that peaceful political systems where differences are managed and where change is accommodated. Everybody has a voice in that. Only an independent media free of state controls can provide that cement and hold those bonds together. Yet in far too many parts of the world, including the Commonwealth, press freedom is now under greater pressure than ever, as we've been hearing about today. According to Reporters Sans Frontières, press freedom in 2015 was at its lowest point in 12 years as a result of a growing climate of fear and government crackdowns on newsrooms and independent journalism. Yes, there are some bright spots in the Commonwealth, and we ought to recognise that. Real progress in places like Sri Lanka, thanks to the courageous and steadfast campaign the press there has fought. In Fiji, where the media has robustly asserted its independence. In Samoa, where the Media Council law adopted only a couple of years ago decriminalised defamation. And in Tonga, but in many other places, the press is tamed and bullied, and as we've heard, the safety of journalists, particularly across South Asia, is constantly in jeopardy. Now, I've spent much of my life fighting for press freedom in the UK, at the Commonwealth, at a European level, and I know there is absolutely no magic wand that can be waved to transform this situation. But I think there are four things that can be done if the leadership of the Commonwealth is prepared to embrace a real agenda for change that can help this situation. Very briefly, because I want finally to touch on one issue to do here with the UK. First, at a practical level, we do have to invest more in the training of journalists, working with established in-country training organisations, because media training here is crucial if press freedom is to take root. Second, and again at a practical level, I believe we should be encouraging more women to play an active role in the media across the Commonwealth, because all the evidence points to the key role of women achieving stability in societies, and there could be no better way to enhance that than to make sure they have a voice in independent media. Third, and this is a much more long-term goal, and Mark was touching on the issues there, we have to ensure the removal of the barriers to development of the free media, from licensing systems, statutory controls, sedition laws, insult laws, anti-terrorist legislation and criminal penalties, as well as building freedom of information laws. Criminal defamation, as Mark said, is still by far the biggest chilling factor of independent journalism. Again, we ought to recognise there has been some progress. Ghana, Sri Lanka, Samoa, and just recently Kenya's High Court, in a very welcome intervention, declared criminal defamation as unconstitutional. But there's a long way to go before this blight on the Commonwealth's media, which is a horrible hangover from the colonial period, like a number of other odious laws, is completely eradicated. And fourth, which has already been covered, we do need to do more to ensure the safety of journalists. You can only have a free media if journalists go about their work free from the fear of intimidation, harassment and physical assault. And the problems of safety in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, as William highlighted, are still very acute, and much more needs to be done to crack down on those who perpetrate these crimes, which are crimes not against just individuals, but against democratic life itself. So there are four areas where I believe we can make progress if we're to protect and enhance the independent media throughout the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. But ladies and gentlemen, forgive me, I'm going to have one UK-centric point at the end, because I'm aware that there's a very large elephant sitting in this room. Because it's all very well for me to stand here and talk about the importance of press freedom and its vital role in a democratic, stable, pluralistic society, when we in the UK are currently facing one of the most serious government assaults on a free press that has ever been seen anywhere, in my view, in the free world. Indeed, this attack on independent journalism, known by the Orwellian, I passed the house that George Orwell lived in appropriately just around the corner from here, known by the Orwellian sounding name of Section 40, would make many a Commonwealth or third world, developing world dictator blush. Section 40, for those of you who are not aware of it, is a law that was rushed onto the statute book in the days after the disastrous Leveson inquiry, in a manner which makes a mockery of parliamentary scrutiny. There was no debate about it, no consultation, no scrutiny on the impact of it. Politicians of all parties were simply falling over themselves in a bloodlust to punish the press. And under this law, newspapers and magazines which do not submit to a state-controlled system of regulation, something which is completely alien to the concept of a free press, will have to pay the entire costs of a legal action for defamation, privacy or harassment even if the person taking the action is proven in court to be a liar and the newspaper is vindicated. That means a newspaper may sometimes face a bill running into many hundreds of thousands of pounds simply for telling the truth. And that's the punishment that's being meted out to publishers here in the UK for refusing to submit to state regulation controls. Now, I need hardly tell you of the disastrous consequences of that for an industry facing the harshest of commercial environments. Lost jobs, lost investment, less public interest reporting and fewer investigations. In some cases, I'm sure that titles will close and probably some publishers. And it's an appalling prospect which is happening right here in the country where the free press was born. At the moment, the government's consulting on whether or not to go ahead with this draconian legislation, and a decision expected later this year. But it seems to me that one of the things the government must take into account, and it's a point put to them forcefully by the CPU and by many other international organisations. I'm very grateful to the press organisations in many Commonwealth countries who put submissions into that government consultation, making strongly these points, is what the impact of Section 40 would be beyond our own shores. There are many governments, and we've seen the chilling echoes of it already in a number of countries, including in the Commonwealth in Sri Lanka, beyond the Commonwealth. It's happened in Ecuador already, who would be happy to copy exactly what's happened here, knowing full well that we would be powerless to do anything about it. And that's a deeply alarming prospect, when we should be taking the issue of free expression and fundamental human rights in the Commonwealth far more seriously than we've ever have done before, because now, as I said at the start of my remarks, our economic and commercial future and our prosperity will depend on it. So if people in the UK are serious about making Brexit a success, and I have my views about that, but I'll keep those for another time, then we have to be serious, it seems to me, about the future of the Commonwealth. And that means in turn being serious about the foundations for prosperity and trade, of which the free media is the essential prerequisite. And on that, the UK and the Commonwealth need to show real leadership. But that seems impossible to me while our own house does not stand in order. So while I've been happy today to set out a number of things, practical points which I think clearly could happen to help improve and enhance press freedom throughout the Commonwealth, if we were to achieve free media and good governance, my message is also to my own government that this must start at home. If we're to take a lead, as I believe we should, in bringing about a real and lasting expansion and freedom of expression throughout the Commonwealth, we have to start right here at home. Thank you very much.